I'm Jerry Purvis for StarHerald.com, and welcome to another outdoor edition of Table Talk. Arbor Day originated in Nebraska to remind people of the importance of trees in our environment. Arbor Day is included in part of the curricula for fourth grade students as they're studying Nebraska history. Well, with the schools closed for the year, it's still important to observe Arbor Day. So our guest today on Table Talk is Chrissy Land, Community Forestry Specialist with the University of Nebraska and the Nebraska Forest Service. Thank you, Chrissy, for joining us today.
Yes, I'd love any opportunity to talk about trees.
Okay, well, first of all, tell us a little history about Arbor Day and how it got started.
Right, so one special thing about Nebraska is we have a gentleman known as Julius Sterling Morton, and in 1854, him and his wife, on the day of their wedding, they moved from Detroit, Michigan to what we know today as Nebraska City, but at the time, Nebraska wasn't even actually a state, it was only a territory. And when they got here, as some of the first pioneers, they kind of quickly realized that the prairies of Nebraska were nothing like the forests of Michigan. And so quickly it was obvious that trees meant a lot to them. It made them comfortable, it provided them with a lot of necessities for their lives, and many other pioneers started coming to the Nebraska territory in the 1860s when a Homestead Act actually allowed people to gain land. And it wasn't actually until, I believe, 67 when Nebraska actually became a state. And before that, Julius Sterling Morton was actually first an editor for one of Nebraska's first newspapers. And so he would share things about environmental awareness and just good stewardship practices. And he was able to really share his enthusiasm for trees through the newspaper, which was really interesting. And it wasn't until actually after Nebraska became a state that he was a part of the Nebraska's Board of Agriculture. And he really just pushed people to set aside one day to celebrate the planting and honor trees. And it wasn't until 1872 that they actually accepted a suggestion from Julius Sterling Morton to put it into legislature that they were going to set aside one day for planting. And what's interesting about the first Arbor Day in Nebraska is that they actually handed out awards to the counties and the individuals who properly planted the most trees. And so it sort of turned into like this neighborly good contest. And ultimately what came of it is that 1 million trees were planted on the first Arbor Day in Nebraska. And ever since, we celebrate it year after year. And many other states actually picked up after Nebraska started that. And now I believe that every state in the U.S. recognizes it. And of course the United States recognizes Arbor Day as a holiday. And every state's a little bit different. Here in Nebraska, we usually celebrate it on the last Friday of April. So this year it's April 24th.
As an educator, can you tell us a little bit about your work with the university and local 4-H clubs and schools and groups like that?
Yeah, it's really fun. A lot of classrooms will invite us to be a part of their Arbor Day celebrations, and we get to do a planting demonstration, talk about the history of Arbor Day, talk about the importance of trees. Nothing's more fun than asking a group of fourth graders what the benefits of trees are, because you get some really fun and interesting answers.
Hey, what are some of the benefits of having trees in the landscape? I know windbreaks and in communities for shade. What are some of the big advantages?
Right. Some of the greatest advantages of having trees in our communities is, like you said, the shade. So we have areas in our communities where we have a lot of concrete and a lot of reflective surfaces, buildings, parking lots, sidewalks, all of the impervious surfaces that water cannot go through and that sunlight bounces off of. And ultimately what happens is we end up with a lot of extremes with our heat and our cold. But if we put trees into the mix, we know that on a hot summer day, we can go stand under the shade of a tree and be more comfortable. And so the more more trees we have, the less heat fluctuations we have in our whole community. And so it can actually increase the property values of our home. It can save us a lot of energy on energy costs for cooling our homes in the summers. And then, like you said, the windbreaks, which is interesting because trees can slow down the speed of wind and can reduce the impacts of the cold winter wind on our homes. It sort of acts as living insulation and helps us with our heating costs in the winter as well. So having our deciduous trees, our big shade trees for cooling, and having our evergreen trees for screening and protecting us from the wind can be very beneficial.
Okay, what are some of the varieties of species of trees that grow best in western Nebraska and are unpredictable in climate and soil conditions?
Right. Well, the best thing to do is to always make sure that you do your research on the tree that you're purchasing. It's always better to start with something that's native, or what we would say adapted to our region. And of course, we have trees that will mature to be small, trees that will mature to be medium-sized, and trees that will mature to be large shade trees. And so it's important to look at your site, sort of decide what you have, and then go from there. But as far as species selection, I really enjoy, for some of our big shade trees, most commonly is things like our catalpa. It blooms in the summer, which is a big, beautiful, more tropical looking tree. We have a Kentucky coffee tree, honey locust, hackberry, many know that. We have a lot of new hybrid elms on the market that will do really well, sort of replacing the traditional American elm. Those are all typically big shade trees. For some medium trees, what I like to do is actually go back to the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum's website, and it's plantnebraska.org /plants, and they have a list of trees for western Nebraska. They actually have a list of many different types of plants, but they break it down to large, medium, and small trees. And so some of those large trees that I had listed are on here, of course, and then of course some medium trees. Here we have like the maple box elder, we have a Burr-Gamble oak, and then of course one of my favorites is an Ohio buckeye. But that list is really interesting because it covers more. We have to remember that western Nebraska is everything from central to west, and so just because it's on the list doesn't mean that the tree it could grow in North Platte, but it might not be so happy in Shadron. So it's important to keep those things in mind. But if you're just going to go to the local store and pick out a tree and take it home, the greatest things that you should look at is the tag, and look for the zone, which is the USDA hardiness zone. We are typically a zone 4 to 5, and so we want to make sure that the trees we're buying are hardy for our winters. And then of course looking at the mature size of the trees, so that way we know when we place that tree it's not going to get so big and outgrow the space that we put it in.
Okay, when you're selecting a tree, what kind of considerations do you make to avoid things, some of the pests, insects, diseases, common things like that affect trees?
Yeah, right now it's really important to know some of the emerging pests that are potentially a threat to some of our tree species. A couple offhand right now are the emerald ash borer, which we do not have in the Panhandle. They have found it in far eastern Nebraska, and that is a non-native pest from Asia that attacks our native ash populations. And so ash trees are not recommended for planting right now, just because of this emerging pest. Another one to take into consideration is the pine sawyer beetle, which carries the pinewood nematode, and that causes what we know as pine wilt in most commonly our Scotch pine. And so Scotch pine now we have actually a native beetle that is affecting a non-native tree. And so it's good just to do your research and check out the Nebraska Forest website, and you can find information on what emerging pests you need to be aware of before you select your tree to take home.
So why is it important to select a wide variety of different species to plant?
Well, exactly for that reason that we just talked about. If you have your whole canopy, say you're going to go out and you want to plant trees down your drive, and you want it to be sentinel trees that just match all the way down the driveway, that's okay, you can do that, but the challenge becomes then, say if you planted all ash trees and an emerging pest like the emerald ash borer shows up at some point in time in the future, then it wipes out all of your trees at once. And if we blow that up to a community-wide scale, and say we have 10% of one species, that is 10% of the whole canopy of all the species is one tree, and something like that happens, then we can end up with losing 10% of our canopy cover and all of those great benefits that the trees provide. And try to make management decisions so that way we have a diverse canopy and not everything packed into maybe 10 species or 12 species. We want all different types of trees.
Okay, so what are some of the misconceptions about tree planting in the area, selecting a size, other considerations?
You know, one of the biggest misconceptions, and it sort of goes along with a malpractice of sorts, but we commonly think that we can just go to the grocery, or not go to the grocery store, but go to the nursery and pick out a tree, bring it home, dig a hole, and just plop the tree in the ground. Well, that's not quite the case. There's definitely a process and an understanding to why trees are sold in containers, and that there is somewhat of a little bit of work that we need to do with those trees before we actually get them in the ground. And so we want to properly plant trees, and we want to properly place trees. We want to make sure that we're putting the right tree in the right place.
So that when it matures, it won't take over the whole space.
Right. When you go to the store, you see this cute little evergreen that just, it would fit perfect in that spot that you're thinking about. But again, you need to look at the tag, see what that mature size is, and make sure that whatever space we're going to put it in is not going to impact something like signage, overhead power lines, the sides of our houses, overspreading a sidewalk or over a curb. All of these things, especially water lines and hydrants, those are important in town and right of way. What's really important is to make sure that you call Digger's Hotline 811 before you dig, especially if you are digging in your front lawn or even in your backyard. They need to locate those underground utilities before you accidentally clip something.
Okay, so for more information, where should people go?
Well, as far as planting goes and anything trees, they can definitely go to the Nebraska Forest website at nfs.unl.edu. We have a tree planting guide on there and all kinds of information about emerging pests. And recently we've uploaded a great video that talks about the benefits of the community forest to the community forestry page that's on the Nebraska Forest website.
And as part of today's show, Chrissy is going to be demonstrating some of the basics about tree planting.
So when you go to the nursery and you are looking to buy a tree, it's important to do a couple of checks. First, I talked about looking at the tag and making sure that the tag reads the space. You want to look at the average size. How large is this tree? This tree is a bur oak, and the average size that it says it's going to grow 50 feet tall and 40 feet wide. Another important part is what the hardiness zone is, which is, this says that it's a zone 3, and this tree prefers to be in the full sun. And so we want to make sure that we put this tree in an area where it can grow to its full mature size without interrupting or interfering with any sort of utilities like overhead power lines, growing into the sides of our houses, or blocking any sort of street signage or anything of that sort. When we're inspecting the tree for quality and health, we want to make sure that there's no broken branches or any apparent gouges to the trunk from when the tree was transported from the growing nursery to the selling nursery. And so it's good to kind of take into consideration the size of tree that you're buying. This would be a size 15 container, and a 1 inch to 1.5 inch caliper tree, and the caliper is the measurement of the size of the trunk. And then of course this tree is more than 10 feet tall. So when it comes time that you actually have your tree at home and we are getting ready to start planting the tree, I always advise people do not dig the hole first, and I will show you why. When the trees are in the nursery, they are planted as seedlings in small pots. And as the trees germinate, as those seeds germinate and the trees start growing, the larger they get, they start moving those trees up pot sizes. And typically what happens is that they'll take a tree, and when they move it up to the next pot, they stick it in the bottom and they'll throw dirt on top. And so what happens is our trees actually come in the containers very commonly buried too deeply in the pot already when we bring it home. And so that's why it's important that when we take this tree out of the bucket, we want to look at the root system, and we want to make sure that we don't have what we call a stem girdling root, which is a root that is growing above the union where the roots meet the trunk. If you think of a skin graft, you can graft skin to skin, but you can't graft a fingernail to your skin. And so we think of roots and trunks as the same way. Trunks and trunks can graft, and roots can graft, but roots and trunks cannot graft. And so if there happens to be a root, like some of these on this tree, that are too high because the soil line was high and the roots were looking for oxygen and other gases, they are starting to lift their roots because they need to breathe. And so then the roots start to grow in a circle, and ultimately it can choke off that side of the tree. And so when we get our tree home, we just want to make sure that we inspect the tree, that we get all of the excess soil off, and we look for any sort of circling roots. One of my favorite tools is the long screwdrivers that are in your toolbox that seem to have no other use except for, of course, inspecting tree roots. And so what you can start to do is loosen up the root system, or the soil around the top, because if we were just to plop this tree down into the hole that we dug, and we dug it this deep, it's potential that what we call the first lateral root of the tree, which is the first main root, ends up too deep. And then our tree roots over time start lifting and raising because the tree was planted too deep. And so we want to come in here and we want to just tease off all of this topsoil and get down to the point where we can find that first lateral root. And we can just use this screwdriver and kind of break up that soil, get those roots pointing out and away from the trunk. And we want to make sure that all of these roots that are potentially circling around the root ball, we want to loosen those out and break them up and get them again pointing out and away from the tree trunk. Okay, so now that we've taken our handy screwdriver and we've gone through and teased out the roots from the confined shape that they were from growing into the container, we are able to kind of look and see, what's going on. Well, now we have our roots all pointing out and away from the tree, and then instead of having the roots kind of wrapping around the tree, that's what we don't want. We can now see how the soil in the pot was up a couple of inches from where our root flare is. And so our root flare is that spot where the roots meet the trunk. And if you look here, you can see where we have the first lateral root. And the way I kind of explain it to people is that if you think about your hand, it's going to be the first root that is of sizable measure. And so all of these little roots that are up here are actually what we call adventitious roots. And if you think about corn that is planted in soil, or even our tomatoes, when we plant our tomatoes in the garden, we typically plant them a little bit deeper so they're not so long and leggy. Well, we can't do that with trees. They are not happy living for a long period if we do that. And so what we can do is we can actually come in and prune these adventitious roots off right at base up against the trunk. We don't want to cut so deep that we're damaging the tissue on the trunk, but we can remove those roots. And if we were just to leave them, the tree would naturally kill them off and actually allow them to fall off. But while we're planting and we have an old pair of pruners that we can work in the dirt with, we can take these small little roots off, and this way now we know that when we put the tree in the ground, this is the top of our soil line. And so that hole that we would have dug as deep as our bucket, we would have wasted all of that time. And so this is why I say you should always look at your root ball before you plant before you dig your hole. And so here we can see the difference of what would have been potentially a 1.5 foot deep hole, that now we only need maybe a 1 foot deep hole. And so when we do dig our hole, it's best to make sure that we dig the hole wide and shallow. We don't want to dig the hole too deep and then throw dirt back into it and then have to sit there and stomp on the soil, because what happens is that you've now loosened up that soil. And what can happen is, if it's really bad, over time that tree will actually begin to settle in the hole. And so you want a solid foundation for that tree to sit on. And so we only want to dig the hole as deep as we need to, so that way the top of the hole is level with our first lateral root. And that first lateral we want to keep within 1 to 2 inches below the soil line. And so digging the hole wide and making sure that before we go and put our soil back in the hole, we take all of these little roots and we point them out and away from the tree from the side that they're attached, and we loosely put the soil back in around the roots. And when we are putting the soil back in and around the roots, we don't want to go around and we don't want to go around and stomp on the soil around the roots, because what happens is that there's a lot of air space in the soil. And if you go through and you compact that soil, you're removing all of that airspace, and that's not good. A healthy soil actually has 50% airspace. And so we want to reduce the amount of compaction that we're doing. And so what we can do is we can take the garden hose and turn it on real low, and we can kind of shove the end of it down into the bottom of the hole that we dug, and allow the water to slowly fill up the bowl of the hole that we dug. And then what happens is, as that water fills up all those spaces in between the soil and the water begins to go down into the soil, what will happen is it will actually pull the soil back down in between all of these fine root hairs, and it will allow the soil to settle around the root ball and get the anchor set in place. Now that we have the tree in the hole, it's important for us to think about the Nebraska wind and what could potentially happen. Not every tree needs to be staked and strapped, but it's definitely important to test your tree and see, will that tree rock in the hole that you've planted it in, or does it seem to be pretty steady and sturdy? Smaller trees tend to be steady and sturdy, unless they come bare root, and that of course is a time when you're going to want to make sure that you strap your tree. So when we're staking our tree and we're using this kind of strap, which is a nice wide band, we want to make sure that we kind of put the straps, if there is a collar or a branch, a spot where you have a branch union that you can put that strap in and keeps the strap from falling down the side of the tree, that can be helpful. A lot of times we'll use 2 or 3 stakes. A lot of times you'll see people use either a wooden 1x1 stake or a metal T-post, and they'll put them on the sides of our prevailing wind, so our northwest and our southeast side of the tree, and then sort of just put those straps on that tree in a way that it's going to kind of hold that tree in place. But the thing is that we don't want it so tight that the tree can't move, because the only reason why we're strapping it is to keep the root ball from rocking in the socket that we've put it in, and so that way the small roots can go and adventure and not be broken every time the wind starts rocking that tree, and we don't want the tree to blow over. But what we do want is that we want the straps to be just loose enough so that the tree can still sway in the wind a little bit, because we want the tree to build taper. We want the tree to build strength in its trunk, so that way over time it becomes adapted to its environment that you've just planted it in. When it comes to straps, one of the common misconceptions is that the straps should be left on and never taken off. Straps are very temporary, and we need to make sure that when we are putting straps on our trees that we go back within a year and we do a rock test, and we want to rock the tree just slightly and see if the root ball still seems to move. If it does seem to move, you can go ahead and leave those straps on for maybe another year. But really, after about 2 years, the roots should have been able to set into the soil around where you planted that tree. And we want to make sure we take these straps back off, because they will restrict the growth of our tree. They can choke out our tree. Many times you'll see where people forget to take the straps off, and the tree has then grown around the straps, and that's just not a healthy thing for our trees to have to deal with. And so just remember that if you do use straps, make sure you go back and check them frequently and take them off when the tree has become established in the planting hole that you've put it in.
About the only thing left that we haven't covered is, what time do you plant?
Well, that's a great question, Jerry. Here in the spring is one of the best times. If you ask people, gardeners and growers and nurseries, when they think you should plant trees, you'll get two answers, either in the spring or in the fall, and some favor one over the other. In the spring, we want to wait until after the soil has thawed, after the ground has thawed from the winter freeze. And then what's nice about planting in the spring is that we typically get more rain in the spring, and so it helps with that watering and that establishment of the tree, which is actually the direct challenge of planting in the fall. But what's nice about planting in the fall is that the soil temperatures are warm and the air temperatures are cooler, and so the tree is not using so much energy to push its leaves. It's actually shutting down and is able to put the energy in its roots. But what happens in the fall is that we typically shut off our sprinkler systems and blow them out, and then our trees aren't getting water into the end of September and October, sometimes even into early November. And so there's challenges with both. Planting in the spring is good, and planting in the fall is good. But it's most importantly making sure that our trees have ample amount of water and care throughout the time during establishment period.
We've been talking with Chrissy Land, Community Forestry Specialist with the University of Nebraska and the Nebraska Forest Service. Chrissy, thank you for joining us and for the demonstration on getting trees planted in the area.
Thank you.
I'm Jerry Purvis for StarHerald.com, and you've been listening to another edition of Table Talk.